Mr. Arthur asked for food and received contempt. His daughter-in-law, in a cold tone, told him he had already eaten enough and pushed a plate of leftovers toward him as if he were a nuisance. Day after day, she humiliated him within the walls he had once helped pay for, denying him even the right to sit with the family. What would you do in the face of such humiliation? Tell us where you're watching from. Leave a like if this story touched you, and subscribe for more. The marble was cold under Mr. Arthur's bare feet. At 78, the chill seeped deep into his bones as he moved slowly through the spacious kitchen of the Parkside District penthouse. The constant hum of the stainless steel refrigerator, mixed with the insistent whistle of the Italian coffee maker, and the sour smell of coffee reheated for the third time that morning. On the tempered glass table, a basket of artisanal bread and vibrant imported fruit sat untouched, as if part of the decor rather than food meant to be eaten. The air conditioning hummed relentlessly. Arthur hugged himself, rubbing the arms of his worn but impeccably clean shirt. The white linen curtains barely moved, like shy ghosts afraid to make a sound. It was a spacious, bright, and cold apartment, not just in temperature, but in a deeper way that Arthur felt more intensely each day. Caroline's heels echoed on the polished hardwood hallway before she appeared in the kitchen. Her presence filled the space with the heavy scent of French perfume. She wore a cream-colored tailored suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her nails painted a glossy red, so perfect they looked artificial. She glanced at her father-in-law with an expression he knew all too well, a mixture of poorly disguised annoyance and superiority. "Standing there like a statue again?" she said, checking her phone without really looking at him. Arthur cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice from sounding too weak. "I'm sorry, Caroline, but could I have something warm? The coffee is cold and..." She let out an exasperated sigh, as if he had asked for the impossible. "This again? If you're cold, put on a sweater," she replied, opening the refrigerator and pulling out a plate with leftovers from the previous night's dinner. "Here, eat this." She shoved the plate with cold remnants of chicken and rice at him. Arthur noticed the metallic glint of the silverware and a smudge of red lipstick on the rim of a dirty cup in the sink, a silent reminder that this home had a mistress, and it wasn't him. From the living room came the buzz of the robot vacuum, moving obediently across the marble floor. The expensive device advanced methodically, cleaning a floor that was already spotless. Arthur held the spoon with trembling hands, trying to make the tremor less obvious. From the hallway drifted the shrill voices of a financial news show that his son, Andrew Sutton, used to play every morning. To stay updated, though he was rarely home to listen anymore. The distant chime of the building's elevator marked another hour in the solitude that stretched before him like an endless desert. "Today is laundry room day," Caroline said, leaving a list written in perfect calligraphy on the granite countertop. "You also need to fold the guest towels and organize the pantry. You know I like everything in its place." She didn't add, "It's the least you can do," but the message hung clearly in the air. Arthur swallowed hard and nodded. The smell of bleach from a bucket in the service area already stung his eyes, even from a distance. There was cold in abundance in that house, but not for him. Expensive food filled the refrigerator, but he ate leftovers. The heating worked perfectly, but never when he was alone. The apartment was full of comforts that seemed to retreat whenever he tried to approach them. Caroline shut the dishwasher with a sharp slam that made the dishes inside rattle. The sound hung in the air, followed by a silence as heavy as an accusation. A silence that invited internal outrage and biting one's tongue to keep from breaking everything. Mr. Arthur looked out the window at the city stretching beyond the glass. It was teeming with life, yet he felt more invisible every day. When had it all started? He couldn't pinpoint it. Perhaps when Teresa, his wife, died, and he accepted Andrew's invitation to live with them. "It's for the best, Dad," his son had said. "You can't be alone at your age." And he wasn't alone, that was true. He was surrounded by people who didn't see him. "If you need anything, don't bother me," Caroline continued, applying another layer of lipstick in the small mirror from her purse. "I have an important meeting with the PTA at Emily's school. I'll be back for dinner." Before Arthur could reply, she was gone, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and that particular silence that hurts more than any shout. He rose slowly and took his barely touched plate to the sink. His movements were careful, as if he feared breaking something or, worse, being noticed. In that luxurious apartment, he had learned to move like a shadow, to take up as little space as possible, to breathe without making a sound. He picked up the list Caroline had left. The first task was to clean the laundry room. His fingers, gnarled by age and a lifetime of hard work, tightened on the paper. There was a time when these same hands had built houses, fixed engines, and held his young son as he learned to walk. Now these hands were for folding towels and cleaning corners no one ever looked at. The oven's digital clock read 10:30 a.m. There were many hours ahead, hours filled with small, humiliating tasks, silences, and scornful glances. Hours in which his dignity hid in some corner of the apartment, like a frightened animal that didn't dare come out. But even amid that, cold, which wasn't just from the air conditioning, Arthur held on to something Caroline hadn't managed to strip from him, the memory of who he had been, the quiet certainty of his own worth. And as he opened the cabinet to get the cleaning supplies, a small but resilient part of him refused to disappear completely under the weight of daily humiliation. With a sigh that held more history than air, Mr. Arthur began his journey in a home that wasn't his, where abundance surrounded but did not include him, where silence weighed as much as an accusation, and where learning to be invisible had become his only defense against contempt. The sun had barely risen over the rooftops of a small town in the heartland, when Arthur, just a 10-year-old boy, was already carrying a basket of corn cakes his mother had prepared since dawn. The smell of corn and husks clung to his clothes as he walked the town's cobblestone streets, hawking his wares, with a pride that only children who work from a young age can understand. Later, with the midday sun beating down, his small but strong hands learned to carry bricks alongside his father on construction sites that had no name, only dust, sun, and thirst. These memories visited Mr. Arthur as he gazed out the window of the Parkside penthouse. His hands, now wrinkled and spotted with age, retained the tactile memory of those days. He had been a man of hard work, a man who never feared honest effort or sweat. Teresa had always understood him. His wife, with those coffee-colored eyes that seemed to hold all the kindness in the world, had been his partner through good times and bad, especially the bad, of which there were many in the beginning. Together, they built a modest but dignified life. Together, they raised Andrew with the hope that he would have opportunities they never knew. And they succeeded. Andrew Sutton was now a successful businessman with a penthouse in one of the city's most exclusive areas. The price of that success, however, had been high. Teresa passed away one afternoon in a hospital when the doctors could do no more against the cancer that consumed her in less than a year. And Arthur was left alone, with an emptiness he tried to fill with the framed photographs that now decorated the hallway walls. A young Andrew with a borrowed backpack, too big for his small frame. A teenage Andrew in the pristine uniform of the private school they had managed to send him to after years of saving. An adult Andrew in a cap and gown on his university graduation day. In his room, the smallest in the apartment and the only one without a city view, Arthur kept two treasures in a carved wooden box that Caroline knew nothing about. A set of rosary beads worn smooth by the constant touch of his fingers, and a photograph of Andrew hugging him on the day he signed his first major contract. "We made it, Dad," read the inscription on the back. The photo had been framed in the living room for the first few, months after Arthur moved in, but one day it vanished. Caroline had decided to refresh the decor, and the family photos were replaced by abstract paintings in neutral tones that better matched the furniture. On the building's rooftop, next to the pots of mint that his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, tended with care, Arthur sometimes found a little peace. He would go up with his small sewing kit and sit in a sunny corner to sew on buttons or mend clothes. Sewing was a skill Teresa had taught him when they married. A man should know how to fend for himself, she had told him with that smile that lit up her face. And although Andrew and Caroline subtly mocked this old lady's hobby, as his daughter-in-law had once called it, for Arthur, sewing was his way of putting the world in order when everything else seemed to be falling apart. "Grandpa!" The crystal-clear voice of Emily, his 8-year-old granddaughter, broke through his thoughts. The girl ran toward him with a piece of paper in her hand. "Look what I drew for you." Arthur smiled, feeling his heart expand in his chest. Emily was pure light, with her uneven pigtails and perpetually scraped knees, despite Caroline's efforts to turn her into a proper young lady. "Let me see, my dear. What have you brought me?" he asked, holding out his hand to take the drawing. On the paper, in colorful, imprecise strokes, Emily had drawn two figures holding hands, a small one with pigtails and a larger one with gray hair. "Grandpa, you are strong," she had written in her childish script. "Do you like it?" the girl asked, bouncing on her feet. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received," Arthur replied, and he wasn't lying. He carefully folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Emily," Caroline's voice came from the rooftop access door. "How many times have I told you not to come up here alone, and certainly not to waste time with—" She glanced at Arthur with disdain. "Distractions." The girl lowered her head and ran to her mother. Before going inside, she turned to give her grandfather one last conspiratorial smile. When he was alone again, Arthur took out the drawing and looked at it for a long time. Then, he stored it with the rosary and the photograph, like someone collecting spring blossoms for the winter days. That evening, as he prepared dinner for Andrew's arrival, something that happened less and less frequently, Caroline entered the kitchen with a determined stride. "I need you to understand something," she said, crossing her arms. "This house runs because of us, our money, our effort." Arthur continued chopping vegetables, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "I know, Caroline, and I'm grateful for—" "Don't interrupt me," she cut in. "What I want to make clear is that here, the one who pays the bills makes the rules, and I don't like the influence you have on Emily. You're filling her head with old-fashioned ideas." The knife stopped on the cutting board. Arthur looked up, and for a moment, he was once again the man who carried bricks under the sun, the man who had worked his entire life so his son could have a better future. "My granddaughter loves me," he said simply, "and I love her. There's nothing old-fashioned about that." Caroline narrowed her eyes, surprised by this small rebellion. "This is just a warning. Don't get confused," she replied, turning and leaving the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. That night, at St. Augustine's Parish, where he would go to light a candle whenever he could slip away, Arthur prayed not for himself, but for Emily. He prayed that his granddaughter would grow up strong and kind, that she would hold on to the light that Caroline seemed determined to extinguish. The church was nearly empty. The smell of incense and melted wax reminded him of his hometown, of Sunday Mass with Teresa. On that worn wooden pew, as the candle flames danced, creating shadows on the stone walls, Arthur remembered what Father Joachim used to tell him when he was young and hardships seemed insurmountable. "Dignity is not negotiable, my son. You just have to uphold it." And it was that certainty, small and stubborn, like a seed between stones, that gave him the strength to get up every morning. Life could bend him, but it would not break him. They could take away his comforts, his respect, even his son's affection. But as long as he kept his dignity intact, he would still be Mr. Arthur Sutton, the man who had built a future for his family with his own hands. With that conviction, like an invisible thread pulling him toward tomorrow, he returned to the apartment as the church clock struck 8. There were still hours until Andrew would arrive, if he arrived at all. But for the first time in a long while, Arthur walked tall, carrying Emily's drawing like a talisman, a promise that not all was lost as long as genuine love existed in that cold home. The days in the Parkside penthouse grew darker for Mr. Arthur. Caroline's treatment worsened so gradually that it could almost have been mistaken for the natural progression of time, like one of those silent diseases that advance without clear symptoms until it's too late. It began with small details, food left out of the refrigerator for too long, with that sour smell that announced it was no longer safe to eat, plates that appeared before him with scraps no one else wanted, increasingly demanding orders like scrubbing the floor until it shines, even if his hands, already battered by decades of work, bled at the knuckles from the effort and chemicals. "If it's not impeccable, start over," Caroline would say, running a gloved finger over the newly cleaned surface, always searching for that invisible speck of dust that would justify her contempt. Arthur, who had always been a robust man, began to lose weight. His pants, once snug at the waist, now hung as if they belonged to another man. The buttons on his shirt seemed misplaced, as if the clothes no longer recognized his body. Hollows formed in his once round, healthy cheeks, shadowing his face. The nights became a torment. He slept little. Fear makes noise in the walls, imaginary footsteps, creaking doors, whispered conversations that always seemed to be about him. He would wake with a start, his heart pounding in his throat, afraid he had made some mistake, forgotten some task, existed too loudly. One morning, as Arthur was sweeping the entrance, the building's doorman, Mr. Davis, approached to greet him. He was a man of few words but a keen eye, and he had noticed the changes in Andrew's father. "Everything all right, Mr. Arthur?" he asked quietly, as if afraid of being overheard. Before he could answer, Caroline's voice sounded behind them, as sweet as poisoned honey. "Mr. Davis, what a pleasure to see you," she exclaimed with a perfect smile. "My father-in-law is fine, just a little tired. You know how it is at his age." Then, turning to Arthur with the same syrupy tone, "If you're not feeling well, we could look for a nice nursing home with good care. Andrew and I have been talking about it." The doorman looked down, uncomfortable, and retreated, muttering an apology. Arthur felt Caroline's words fall on him like stones. It wasn't the first time she had mentioned the nursing home as a veiled threat, a reminder that his presence in that house was conditional, temporary. That afternoon, when Arthur tried to sit in the living room to watch a football game, one of the few pleasures he still had, Caroline entered and, without a word, took the remote and turned off the television. "This sofa is for guests," she decreed, looking at him as one might look at a stain on an expensive rug. "If you want to watch television, you can use the small one in your room." Arthur nodded and rose slowly, trying to ignore the pain in his knees, the weight of the humiliation, the dull anger burning in his throat. He retreated to his room, a space that felt more and more like a cell, and turned on the small television that barely picked up 3 channels. But he couldn't focus on the screen. Caroline's words about the nursing home echoed in his mind like a funeral drum. That night, as the building fell silent and the city outside breathed with the distant hum of sirens and traffic, Arthur got up to use the bathroom. As he passed through the hallway, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was Caroline's voice, low but clear, speaking on the phone in her office. "Yes, I have everything prepared," she was saying with a cadence Arthur had never heard her use, cold and calculating. "If he signs the power of attorney, we can move everything into my name before the end of the month." There was a pause. Arthur held his breath, feeling his heart beat against his ribs like a caged animal. "He's softened up, just needs a little push," Caroline continued, followed by a short, dry laugh that seemed to tear through the air. "Andrew is too busy to notice. He trusts me completely with family matters." Another pause. Arthur leaned against the wall, feeling his legs weaken. "The old man is the only obstacle, but with this nursing home story, you know how it is. Once he's in there, it'll be easier to get him to sign. No one wants to die alone," Caroline concluded with a chill that froze Arthur's blood. Careful not to make a sound, he returned to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a different kind of cold, not from the air, but from his soul. Caroline's words had confirmed what a part of him already suspected. This wasn't just contempt, it was something more sinister. There was a plan in motion, a plan involving his signature, his money, the life savings he had put in Andrew's name when he moved in, and his eventual disappearance into some nursing home where no one would visit him. Dawn found him still awake, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The gray light filtering through the small window cast strange shadows on the walls, shapes that seemed to laugh at him, at his naivety, at his blind trust in a son who no longer saw him. In the kitchen hours later, Nadia, the housekeeper who came 3 times a week, served him a steaming cup of coffee when Caroline wasn't there to stop her. It was a small but significant gesture, an act of kindness amid so much hostility. "Thank you, Nadia," Arthur whispered, wrapping his hands around the cup to absorb its warmth. She nodded, moving past him with an awkward gesture, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. There was a tension in her posture, a knowledge in her eyes that Arthur recognized immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, taking advantage of their being alone. Nadia glanced nervously at the door before answering. "I didn't see anything, sir. Don't get me in trouble." She pressed her lips together, terrified, and added almost voicelessly, "Be careful with the madam. I've seen things." Caroline's sudden arrival cut the conversation short. Nadia quickly moved away, pretending to dust a piece of furniture that was already gleaming. Nadia's verbal denial had, paradoxically, been a silent confirmation of Arthur's worst fears. He wasn't imagining things, he wasn't exaggerating. There was a real danger lurking in the house he once believed would be his refuge in old age. That afternoon, sitting on the rooftop next to Mrs. Peterson's mint plants, Arthur took the worn rosary from his pocket. The beads, polished by years of prayers, slid through his trembling fingers as he prayed, not for peace or comfort, but for clarity, for strength, for a sign of what to do in the face of the threat he now knew was real. At his feet, the city stretched out, immense and indifferent. Somewhere among those millions of lights was Andrew, his son, the boy for whom he had worked until he bled, the young man in whom he had placed all his hopes. How could he reach him? How could he make him see what was happening under his own roof? In his chest, the sadness that had accompanied him for months mixed with something new. A suspicion turned into certainty, a fear converted into resolve. And for the first time since he had arrived at that cold, hostile house, he felt a different spark ignite within him, not of anger or hatred, but of determination. Something hidden was about to come to light, and he, Mr. Arthur Sutton, the man who had survived poverty, backbreaking labor, and the loss of his beloved wife, would not allow them to strip him of his dignity as well. He put away the rosary and took out Emily's drawing. "Grandpa, you are strong," he read again, and he decided that, for his granddaughter, for Teresa, for himself, he would be strong one more time. Although the how was not yet clear, he knew that the truth would find its way to the light. He had to find it before it was too late. On Friday afternoon, the sky over the city darkened with storm clouds. The first drops of rain tapped against the windows of the Parkside penthouse, creating an irregular rhythm that accompanied the tense silence in the kitchen. Andrew Sutton wasn't supposed to be home so early. On Fridays, he usually stayed late at the office, closing out the week with meetings and international calls. But something, perhaps intuition, perhaps simple chance, had prompted him to cancel his last video conference and drive home through the rain. The electronic chime of the entry system announced his arrival. He dropped his leather briefcase on the entryway console, making a dull thud that echoed down the hall. He was loosening his tie when he heard a sentence that chilled him to the bone. "If you're hungry, lick last night's plate." Caroline's voice carried clearly from the kitchen, in a tone Andrew had never heard from her. It was cold, sharp, contemptuous. There was the sound of shattering ceramic, a plate hitting the floor and breaking into pieces. Andrew stood frozen in the doorway, holding his breath, witnessing a scene that felt like a nightmare. His father, Mr. Arthur, was crouched down, picking up the porcelain shards with trembling hands. His face was pale, and he wore an expression of fear that Andrew had never seen on the man who raised him, the man who had always been a model of strength and dignity. "Dad." The word escaped his lips like a pained whisper, and that single syllable seemed to change the temperature of the air. Caroline spun around, her eyes wide with surprise. Her face, which moments before had shown contempt, morphed into a mask of concern and sweetness. "Honey, we weren't expecting you so soon," she said, moving toward him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father dropped a plate. You know how he's been lately, so clumsy." Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the porcelain fragments he held in his hands, which were now cut by the sharp edges. A drop of blood fell onto the marble floor, as bright as a ruby. Andrew was about to respond when a small voice called from the hallway. "Daddy, why isn't Grandpa allowed to sit in the living room?" Emily stood at the kitchen entrance, still in her school uniform, a look of genuine confusion on her young face. Her large eyes were fixed on her father, waiting for an answer to explain the unexplainable. "What are you talking about, sweetie?" Andrew asked, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. "Mommy said Grandpa doesn't deserve to sit in the living room," the girl answered with the brutal honesty of childhood. "She said that sofa is too expensive for someone who just gets in the way." The truth, clean and courageous, had come from the mouth of an innocent. The silence that followed was so thick you could almost touch it. Caroline visibly paled as her perfect facade began to crack. "Emily, honey, you don't know what you're saying," she tried to correct, with a nervous laugh. "You must have misunderstood. I never—" From the service entrance, Nadia, the housekeeper, watched the scene with a tense expression. When Andrew's gaze met hers, she swallowed hard and, after a moment's hesitation, gave a nearly imperceptible nod, silently confirming the little girl's story. Something inside Andrew broke. It wasn't a violent explosion, but a deep fissure in the foundations of what he believed to be true. Like those cracks in buildings that start small and end up bringing down entire structures. Without a word, he took out his phone and opened the building's security system app. He checked the recordings from the intercom cameras installed in the common areas. The building kept audio records in those spaces, something Caroline had apparently forgotten. With fingers that barely obeyed him, he requested the logs from the past few weeks from the administrator. The response was almost immediate. There they were. Fragments of conversations near the elevator, in the lobby, at the apartment entrance. Fragments that, like pieces of a macabre puzzle, revealed a pattern of repeated humiliations. Can't you walk any faster? You're in everyone's way. When you finally go to that nursing home, I can redecorate that room. You're a burden, you know that? Andrew is too soft on you. Each sentence was a dagger. Each word revealed a daily hell that had been unfolding under his own roof while he chased million-dollar contracts and professional accolades. "Emily, go to your room, please," Andrew said in a strangely calm voice. "Nadia, please go with her." When the girl and the housekeeper had left, Andrew took a deep breath and looked at his father, truly looked at him for the first time in months. He saw the hollow cheeks where there was once fullness, the slumped shoulders where there was once pride, the tremor in the hands where there was once steadiness. With decisive steps, he approached Arthur, took the porcelain shards from his bloodied hands, and placed them in the sink. Then, with a gentleness that contrasted with the storm raging inside him, he led his father to the main table and sat him at its head. "This is your place," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This house is as much yours as it is mine." Caroline started to protest, but Andrew raised a hand, silencing her. "I don't want to hear from you right now." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it was final. "I don't trust what might come out of your mouth." He took a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around his father's injured hand. Then, without letting go of the hand that had supported him his entire life, he picked up his phone again and dialed a number. "Richard, it's Andrew," he said to the lawyer, who had been with him through countless business negotiations. "I need to see you today. It's an urgent family matter." As he spoke, he kept his eyes on his father, on that face weathered by work and time, which now showed a mix of confusion, relief, and something Andrew hadn't seen in a very long time: hope. That same night, as the rain beat against the windows and the city gleamed wetly under the streetlights, Richard Mendez, a prestigious attorney specializing in estate matters, spread several documents across the dining table. With professional efficiency, but also with the empathy of someone who understands the human drama behind the paperwork, they updated wills and powers of attorney. Assets were protected in Arthur's name, clear boundaries for cohabitation were established, and a formal notice was drafted for the building management to deny access to anyone who mistreated the Sutton family patriarch. Caroline watched from a corner, arms crossed, her expression calculating. Her flawless makeup couldn't hide the contained fury that tensed her features. When everything was signed and Richard had left, promising to start the proceedings first thing Monday morning, Andrew sat next to his father. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, leaving behind that distinct smell of wet asphalt rising from the streets. Arthur felt the weight on his back shift, not because it was gone, but because someone was finally helping him carry it. Hope was no longer a faint whisper, but a concrete step toward justice. "Forgive me, Dad," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so busy building an empire that I didn't see my own home falling apart." Arthur squeezed his son's hand with a strength that surprised them both. In his tired but clear eyes, there was a quiet certainty as he replied, "It's never too late to do the right thing, my son. Never." Sunday dawned bright, as if Friday's storm had cleansed not only the sky, but also the air inside the apartment. Light poured through the windows, casting golden rectangles on the marble floor that Arthur would no longer have to scrub until his hands bled. In the spacious kitchen, the aromas of freshly brewed coffee and toasted bread mingled, creating the sense of home that had been missing for months. Andrew, his shirt sleeves rolled up, prepared breakfast while Emily set the table. They weren't using the everyday dishes, but the fine china that Caroline reserved for important guests. "Is this okay, Daddy?" the girl asked, unsure of the unusual task. "It's perfect, sweetie," Andrew replied, affectionately tousling her hair. "Go get Grandpa, please." Arthur appeared in the kitchen moments later, guided by his granddaughter's small hand. He wore a clean shirt, the one Teresa had given him for their last anniversary together, and his hair was neatly combed, There was a cautious expression on his face, as if he feared this was all a dream from which he would soon wake. "Good morning," he said, pausing in the doorway. "Good morning, Dad," Andrew answered, gesturing to the head of the table. "Your seat is ready." As they were eating, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Peterson and her husband, the neighbors from 7B, arriving punctually for Andrew's invitation. Behind them were Mr. Davis, the doorman, looking visibly uncomfortable in his Sunday suit, and Mr. Jennings, the building administrator, with a folder under his arm. Caroline emerged from the master bedroom as the voices of the new arrivals filled the space. She was dressed with her usual elegance, but something in her expression had shifted. The arrogant confidence was replaced by a calculated wariness, like a predator who suddenly finds itself surrounded. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, looking at the set table and the seated guests. "Please, sit down," Andrew said, pointing to a chair at the opposite end from where Arthur sat. "There are matters we need to clarify, and it's best to do so with witnesses." When everyone was settled, including Nadia, who sat timidly next to Mrs. Peterson, Andrew took a deep breath. His face held the serenity of someone who has made a difficult but correct decision. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I've gathered you here because I need you to witness what I'm about to say. Something unacceptable has happened in this house, and I want to make it clear that it will not happen again." He looked directly at Caroline before continuing. "In this house, no one is humiliated, least of all my father." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clink of a teaspoon against a cup. Andrew picked up his phone and, after a few taps, placed the device in the center of the table. Caroline's voice filled the room, played from the intercom's audio recordings. "If you don't like it, go to a nursing home. No one would miss you. This sofa costs more than anything you've ever owned. Don't sit there. As long as I'm paying the bills, you'll keep your mouth shut. Got it, old man?" Each sentence cut through the air like a knife. Mrs. Peterson quietly made the sign of the cross. Mr. Davis clenched his fists on the table, his expression confirming he had witnessed similar situations. When the recording ended, Andrew showed them the broken plate from Friday, the fragments of which he had carefully saved in a bag. He also produced the list of chores Caroline had been leaving for Arthur, tasks that seemed designed not to keep the house clean, but to humiliate and punish. "This isn't work, it's abuse," he stated, placing the list next to the broken plate. "And it's been happening for months, while I was too busy to see." Caroline tried to interrupt, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "This is all taken out of context. You can't believe that." "Out of context?" Andrew repeated, not raising his voice, but with a firmness that silenced any protest. "What context could possibly justify this?" He pointed to his father's hands, still raw from months of forced labor and harsh chemicals. Arthur's weary face, the dark circles under his eyes, the evident thinness of someone who had been deprived not only of adequate food, but also of dignity. Andrew walked around the table, as if seeing his own home for the first time. His footsteps echoed on the marble with the clarity of a declaration. "Dad," he said, stopping beside Arthur, "forgive my blindness. Forgive me for not seeing what was happening under my own roof." Then he turned to the guests and announced in a calm but unyielding voice, "As of today, changes are being made in this house. Caroline will leave the apartment today. Her digital access will be revoked. She will no longer manage any household expenses, nor have any authority over family decisions." Mr. Jennings nodded gravely, making a note in his pad. As the building administrator, he was obligated to document incidents affecting the residents' well-being. "I've prepared a document," Andrew continued, holding out a folder Richard Mendez had prepared the night before. "It's a temporary protective order until a judge issues a permanent one. No one who mistreats my father will have access to this house." Mr. Davis cleared his throat before speaking. "Mr. Sutton, you have my full support. I will personally ensure these arrangements are respected at the building's entrance." There were no insults or shouts, not even when Caroline stood up abruptly, knocking her chair over. There was no pushing or door slamming, just a clear line drawn with the precision of someone who has seen the truth and can no longer return to blindness. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal belongings," Andrew informed Caroline. "The rest will be sent wherever you instruct, once the lawyers determine what is legally yours." "You can't do this to me," Caroline's voice trembled, not with fear, but with restrained rage. Everything I did was for us, for our future. No, Andrew cut in. You did it for you. There was never an us that included my father's suffering. When Caroline disappeared into the master bedroom to gather her things, Arthur slowly stood up. His eyes, moist but serene, scanned the faces of those present. There was no shame in his gaze, only a reclaimed dignity that illuminated his features like a sunrise. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for seeing me." An hour later, when Caroline crossed the threshold with her perfect handbag and a designer suitcase, the apartment seemed to take a breath. The door closed behind her, not with a dramatic slam, but with a soft click that sounded like a final punctuation mark. The light streamed in differently from the balcony, and the wall clock resumed marking time without urgency. The silence that remained was not heavy or accusatory. It was the clean silence that follows the truth. Arthur, seated at the head of the table, held the cloth napkin like a simple banner. His rough, weathered fingers smoothed the fabric, erasing its wrinkles with the same patience with which he had endured months of humiliation. The family ate together under the midday sun that poured through the windows, and the house, that house that had been cold and alienating, once again spoke a forgotten word: respect. That afternoon, as Emily read a story sitting next to her grandfather, Andrew watched them from the doorway. The girl's voice filled the space with tales of bravery and justice, themes that now resonated with renewed force in their newly recovered home. On the hallway wall, where Caroline's abstract paintings had once hung, Andrew had rehung the family photographs, Arthur and Teresa on their wedding day, Andrew graduating from university with his father by his side, a baby Emily in her grandfather's arms. It was as if the house was breathing for the first time in a long time, as if the walls, the furniture, even the air, recognized that something fundamental had been restored, not just the patriarch's authority, but the very essence of what makes a house a home. The consequences of that Sunday arrived swiftly and for all to see. There was no noise or scandal, only the silent precision of justice when it finally finds its way. The elder abuse complaint moved forward with surprising speed, bolstered by the compelling evidence Andrew had gathered. The building's audio recordings, the photographs of Arthur's injured hands, the testimonies from Nadia and the neighbors, the lists of humiliating chores written in Caroline's perfect script. Judge Fernandez, a man, in his 60s known for being impartial but firm, listened intently to each testimony. His gaze lingered on Mr. Arthur, who spoke in a quiet, clear voice, without a hint of vengeance in his words, only truth. "I'm not seeking punishment," he said at the end of his statement. "I only hope that no one else has to go through this, that no other elderly person has to feel like a burden in their own children's home." Those words, spoken without drama but with a dignity that filled the courtroom, weighed heavily on the final decision. The judge granted a permanent protective order and issued an exemplary sentence. Caroline was to complete 300 hours of mandatory community service at a geriatric center, under strict supervision and with no possibility of parole. "The mistreatment of our elders," the judge said in his ruling, "is a form of violence our society has ignored for too long. This court believes that the best way to understand the harm caused is by working directly with those who deserve our utmost respect." He also imposed a significant fine, which would be allocated to programs protecting vulnerable seniors. The amount, though substantial, was not the point. What mattered was the message it sent to the community. In the divorce proceedings, which moved forward concurrently, Caroline lost access to the accounts and assets she had been on the verge of appropriating. Her reputation, once curated like a gleaming shop window, now reflected her actions. The exclusive friendships she valued so much quietly drifted away. As often happens when the truth lays a person's true character bare, there was no scandalous revenge or public shaming beyond what justice required. There were no insults or smear campaigns. There was only law and truth, walking together with the serenity of the inevitable. At St. Augustine's Parish, after the final hearing, Arthur and Andrew lit a candle without any grand pronouncements. The flame danced softly, illuminating the face of the Virgin Mary on the side altar. They stood in silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts, united by the invisible thread that connects fathers and sons beyond words. "Do you know what your mother said to me the day you were born?" Arthur asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on the flame. Andrew shook his head. Teresa had passed away when he was in college, and there were many conversations they never had time to share. "She told me, Make sure he grows up strong on the outside, but even stronger on the inside. Arthur continued, a gentle smile on his lips. I think we did it, son. Back at the apartment, now transformed into a true home, Emily was waiting with a surprise. She had placed her drawing of a strong Arthur in the most visible spot in the living room. Andrew had had it framed, and it now held a place of honor among the family photographs. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. It was not the oppressive silence of fear or the tense silence of injustice. It was the comfortable silence of those who don't need to fill every space with words, because understanding flows without them. Andrew made hot chocolate, creamy just the way his father liked it, and the three of them sat in the living room. Outside, dusk began to settle over the city, painting the sky in oranges and purples that filtered through the windows. Dad, Andrew finally said, his voice thick with emotion, forgive me for being late to your pain. Arthur looked at him with eyes like damp earth, the kind that have seen rains and droughts, plantings and harvests, yet still retain the capacity for wonder. Son, you arrived in time to save my dignity, he replied, covering his son's strong hand with his own rough one. That's what matters. They embraced for a long time, needing no more words, while Emily watched with the special intuition of children who understand more than they can express. The next day, a carpenter arrived early. On Andrew's instructions, he installed a new kitchen table, one made of solid, warm wood, a stark contrast to the cold glass surface Caroline had chosen. It was at this table that Arthur finally sliced his warm bread without hurry, savoring the aroma and texture as if celebrating a sacred ritual. The neighbors in the building began to greet him by name, without the mix of pity and shame that had previously colored their interactions. Mr. Davis set aside his mail with special care and always had time for a brief chat about the weather or the news. Mrs. Gonsalves from 10A even started sending him homemade cookies. Because single men always appreciate a little something sweet, she'd say with a warm wink. Nadia continued to work at the apartment, but now with reasonable hours and fair tasks. Her relationship with Arthur transformed into a respectful collaboration, where they both cared for the home in their own ways. One afternoon, while watering the plants on the terrace, Arthur received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Peterson arrived with a pot of fresh mint. So, you can have your own little garden, Mr. Arthur, she said, placing the plant in a sunny corner. Plants are like people. They need respect, light, and a good place to put down roots. Time moved on, its course inevitable. The seasons changed, the rains came and went, and life found its new rhythm in the restored home. Andrew rearranged his priorities. He was still a successful businessman, but now he came home early 3 times a week to have dinner with his father and daughter. One evening after Emily was asleep and the quiet of night enveloped the apartment, Arthur took the worn rosary and the old photograph from his wooden box. The inscription, "We made it, Dad," now resonated with a new, deeper meaning. Next to these treasures, he placed something new, a court order that, in its formal, technical language, recognized an elderly man's right to be treated with dignity. It was not just a piece of paper, it was the confirmation that his value as a human being did not diminish with age or depend on his ability to produce. The house was no longer a territory of fear, it was a home. The walls that had been silent witnesses to humiliation now echoed with laughter, conversation, and the comforting sounds of daily life shared in love. And the lesson was etched clearly in the memory of all who knew the story. Family justice doesn't shout, it endures. It endures with firmness, with love, with determination. Because where a son defends his father, where truth confronts abuse, where respect is laid as the cornerstone of life together, dignity returns to its seat at the head of the table, the guest of honor who should never have been asked to leave. For Mr. Arthur Sutton, the man who had woken before dawn to sell corn cakes, who had carried bricks under a punishing sun, who had lost his wife and nearly lost his dignity, life now had a different flavor. It was the sweet taste of justice, the warm taste of recognition, and the unparalleled taste of finally being home.